So I want to get away from that sense of I'm not doing it enough, and more like, I wonder if I could increase in this area, or I wonder if I keep seeming to use English with this setting. How can I solve that and make that something I do more in target language? So that's kind of my philosophy for what we're doing today. And how's it going?
We'll get it.
Should we give it up?
No, never give up, never surrender.
Okay. I kind of need to see my notes to go to the next slide, though.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay. I'm on the online one. Yeah. Right. So one back. There we go. Yeah. So I'll use two terms, and I just want to make sure that they're familiar. So target language is, what do I mean by target language? The new language, the language your students don't yet know, but you want them to know, right? So in my case, it's Mandarin Chinese usually, and maybe Spanish, French, German, right? And then L1 is English in the case of most of our students, but not necessarily, right? There could be various languages of Burma, Spanish, certainly French in a lot of Iowa. So their first language is what I mean by L1. So using reference to the student's first language. So if my notes do come up, those terms are in there. So TL stands for target language, and L1 stands for, oh, excellent. I have living presentation materials. L1 is first language, so first language of the students. In my case, that's English for me, too. So I usually shared the first language with my students, but not necessarily the case. So what are your dreams for target language use? Think about that for a moment and speak with someone seated near you for just about 20 seconds. What are your dreams for target language use in your classroom? Still going crazy? Well, I haven't done the full shutdown on my computer, and that would be the thing I would do.
Well, my temporary solution would be we make a bit.ly for it so that they can access it on their laptops, and they just click through with you. So like you're not referring here, but they can see it there.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And I can help you with that if you need to be teaching still.
That would be super.
Yeah.
I think I got that. Yeah.
So you have to have the dot
Linked.
here. I got you. I'll do it.
Oh, okay.
Keep teaching. Let me know when you need
Okay,
this.
you're super. I'm super impressed. Okay. I will need to see my notes again just to keep me on track. But great. If you can hear my voice, if you would stop and raise your hands. So when you hear my voice, just stop and raise your hand. Ooh, real close. Okay, cool. Let's listen for like 4 or 5. What are your dreams with target language use in your classroom?
Mine is spontaneous use.
Spontaneous use. Nice.
More of an immersion, 100% immersion.
Okay, lots and lots. So to the point of 100% of what they hear and see, or are you thinking
mainly
here?
what they're producing and then hearing from me.
Okay, both students and you.
Yeah.
Something else? Let's try a third.
Incomprehensible, not understandable, communication between teacher and students or among them.
Yeah. So they're hearing lots of language and they're understanding what they hear, too. So great stuff. Yeah, I think my dream with my own classroom in high school more recently was to have it be normal to talk in Chinese in the Chinese classroom, to have it feel like that was the social language that we shared, too. So trying to shift it from just, oh, that's what we do when we work, but to like, that's what we do because we are together and we speak in Chinese when we're together. So that was one of my dreams. I'm going to need to check back with the first one. Okay, and then to think about this and talk with someone next to you, in what ways do you intend to use the first language of your students? And the answer could vary widely, but think about that one and share again. In what ways do you plan to use first language with your students, their first language?
Okay,
How's it,
I got
how's
this.
it going? Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for all your help. I know. I got this work in the classroom, but it was not with this. It was with the HDMI, and I wonder if this thing, maybe, I bought this cheap on the internet, and I've never tested it. But actually, but I used the HDMI side of it, so maybe that was because it could handle this, but that one's fine. I don't know. And this is a kind of goofy computer anyway, so it's bizarre.
Thank you.
Okay, if you hear my voice, if you want to raise your hand, and we'll come back together and share a little bit. So once you hear my voice, if you just stop and look this direction, raise your hand, and there you go. Okay, great. How do you plan to use the first language of your students?
Mine is for feedback.
Feedback.
But bueno no bueno doesn't give me any feedback, but the first language would say, I was frustrated when this happened, or I really understand that. I couldn't do that in that time.
Got it. Something that they can't yet produce in the target language, but it's such important information for you to get. Uh-huh. I saw a hand over here. Yeah.
Comparisons, if there's like cognates between both languages.
Yeah, so clarifying some connection to their first language. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe and on the lines of feedback in like a journal, when we're reflecting on class, like if it isn't 100% entirely language, what were some things that you worked through that were challenging for you this week? Or what's something you have acquired now, establishing meaning.
Yeah. Okay, so you had two things in there. One was the metacognitive stuff, like students reflecting on their learning and their process. And I've even seen advocates that say zero use of English should ever happen in class. They will still say, and I was like, oh, really? That metacognitive stuff is really valuable. And also explaining to students, why are we doing this in class? How does our class work? So those are legit uses that make the rest of the class, where you're predominantly target language, more powerful, because they're on board a little more. And then you mentioned establishing meaning. Do you want to describe what you mean?
Yeah, so like if I have a target structure, I want to make sure that they understand that corre means run, if I'm doing a gesture, that they understand exactly what that means.
Right. The first language can clarify the meaning very precisely in a way that gestures can aid, but maybe not replace. Sound like, yeah. Anything else? I like it. Oh, it moved again. How's it going?
We will be fine. You are here.
Okay. She's working on sharing a link so you can follow along in the presentation and just click through with me. So some things to consider about, like, why would you want to use more target language? Here, I'll do this for those of you with really good eyes. Acquisition of language is based on receiving comprehensible input, right? That's kind of that's a given. There are disagreements about exactly like what role does input have, but all pretty much are like, yes, we need to receive messages in target language and understand them in order to acquire the language. So students need lots and lots of that opportunity, so we want to provide lots of target language use with that. We also have very limited class time per year, so if we can increase how much target language we use, presumably, probably, our students have a better chance of getting a better proficiency level out of our classes. And more target language has been correlated to better proficiency outcomes in a research study. So, and I know because I was involved with writing about that one. So, so I really believe in this personally, as well as then seeing it in a study. Some other issues to consider, though, is the first language okay for some purposes? We just talked about some possible ways to use first language to clarify the meaning of the new language, to allow students to share something that they can't yet produce in the target language, to think about their learning process and think about what they need in class. Do you think it differs for teacher versus student? Do you think it differs between level 1 students in the first semester and level 3 students in the second semester? Or, some things to think about. I think there's a room for some gray areas, and I think there might be situations that could be different depending on your own teaching setting. So you want to consider your own setting and your own needs. Something else to think about is it okay to mix languages? Like, can you use an English word in a sentence because you're afraid they're going to lose comprehension, but basically you've got a German sentence that you got out, but you threw in that one English word just to make sure that the rest of it got understood? I do this a lot in Chinese. I think it's okay. So I don't want to overuse it, and I don't want to avoid using new Chinese words, but I want to limit how many Chinese words are brand new at once. And so sometimes I have been known to do that. With a very beginning level 1 class, we talked about what they liked and didn't like. And someone said, didn't like broccoli. I could have introduced xilanhua, but that sounds pretty different, right? I'm already concentrating on them hearing 喜欢你我 ma, new question format, all these things. Lots and lots of new languages already hitting them. So I thought for that one item that's not a super important word in Chinese, I'm going to throw the English in. So I think sometimes mixing could be okay. We're still giving them lots and lots of target language exposure. And they're hearing it in a bed of target language. It's not like I had one Chinese word and all the rest was English. It was, here's basically Chinese, and we just borrowed in this one word. And then we already mentioned the act full position statement. I'm curious, does anybody have a school or a department where you're actually graded or rated in your observations by an administrator for how much target language you use? Anybody have that? Okay, I'm interested in this because I've been reading about it a lot, and I haven't seen too many of those, but there are a few cases where I've heard of it. So in what situations do you find yourself using English, assuming that's the first language of your students, more than you'd like? We could do this as a turn and talk, or if you'd prefer just to shout out. Can we do shout outs? Grammar instruction, talking about grammar. Other things?
Directions for like activities.
Directions for activities. Yeah. Direction giving.
I'll find myself randomly saying English words while I'm talking. Like I say, okay, all right. I was like, stop.
Yeah. So like your default is
yeah.
like, because your first language is English, and so it just kind of pops occasionally. Yeah. Things.
Behavior management.
Behavior management. Ah, yes. Yeah. Classroom management stuff. Yeah.
I've had situations where I've had kind of a double language barrier because their first language was not English. Like I had a student whose first language was Spanish, and her English was not very good, and then she's in a French class. So I've had to kind of slow down and speak in English in order for her to understand what was going on.
Because she had limited English as well.
So kind of in that double language barrier.
Right.
situation.
Yeah, I think that's going to be more common, too. If you haven't encountered it yet, I think it will.
French to English to Spanish.
Yeah. And then in what situations do your students use English more than you would like? Still kind of brainstorming, like, okay, where are our spots that we're going to go in and make a plan? Like random side conversations and stuff like that?
Or getting with partners, and the minute they get with a partner, they start speaking in English before they start the activity.
Right. Yeah, I think partner practice kinds of stuff are classic for turning into an English chat time. Yeah. Other times your students are using more English than you'd like?
Any kind of class creation or story creation or any OWI like creation, because they want to say these obscure like storylines, and we just like we don't know how to say
Yeah.
they were cannibal and this fish ate the other fish. And, I mean, we can say this fish ate the other fish, but we don't know anything about cannibalism, and now they
Right.
Yeah.
They went for this very technical
Yes.
thing that they were thinking about it in English because they they're mature in their English mind, but their new language mind is just very limited, and so yeah, they're drawing on that. Yeah, sounds like some classics. So we're going to look at where are these things breaking down and start to make some plans that relate to each one of those. You've already mentioned them, but if you imagine when you think teachers use the first language in class the most, in studies where they've sat in on classes and they've taken notes about what is the purpose for which this teacher is speaking in building rapport with students. So that one you hadn't mentioned, but I bet you would, if you start to think about it, you may find yourself doing it. And I think it's almost like what you had said about the, like you just kind of blurt the okay. I think this is why I was working with myself on making Chinese the social language in class, the casual language, the way we connect all the time in class, so that when I was talking to my student about something that was just their personal life before we started class, I wanted to use Chinese for that to the degree that I could and make that feel normal to that student so that I could increase the target language time. Explaining word or sentence meaning, to clarify meaning or to establish meaning, to explain grammar points, and then to inform students about expectations for class. So those were the most common things that people were using them for. And I've got a bunch of lists of where those points came from. If you're interested, I can share that. So let's look first at giving instructions then. Here are some things that had worked for me, and if you have other thoughts as I share these, I'd love to hear them because I think this is a great topic to think about. I used total physical response to help me give instructions. And what I mean is not so much that I had the activity and I did the whole instructions as TPR, but more that I figured out, like, what are the things that I need to tell them to do that I'm using English to do now? And let's break those down into small steps that I can use TPR to do. So, for example, I found my students, I wanted them to get up out of their chairs quietly, walk over to the bookshelf that was along that wall, choose a book, sit back down. Or walk over there, pick up a whiteboard, a marker, and an eraser, and sit back down. I wanted them to stand up quickly and quietly and pick up their chair and put the chairs in one place. And so I made the list of things that I knew I wanted them to do, and then started a little bit at a time in level 1, where maybe for 10 minutes a day in the first month, or maybe not the first month, 2.5 weeks or so, we would do that. And we'd keep adding adverbs. So if you stand up, pick up your chair slowly. Of course, this I would be speaking in Chinese at this point, right? I'm just using English because that's what we share, right? So, because it's all about target language, right? So, just clarifying. So they're picking up the chair. Romantically, put the chair on the stack, and then, not sexily, romantically put the chair. So making it a little more fun, and then I would start asking them. So that it wasn't everyone having to do it. It was like, who would like to volunteer to show us how to really do this? And so somebody, and then I'd take suggestions about, I have 1 or 2 kids, and okay, what shall they walk to the whiteboards as if they had a cold? Or will they walk to the whiteboard weirdly? I don't know. With a cold is pretty weird too. But and so I had a list on a sheet of paper. It had the English, it had the Chinese. I'd hold it up. I would point to the English meaning, and I'd say the Chinese as we would do this. So I'm holding it around the room and showing them. So again, I'm using their first language, but I'm not saying it necessarily. Usually I did not need to say it. And that added so much more interest. It got those little chunks of directions down. Let's see if I got that in there. Yeah. Along those lines, also, naming activities that I used often was very helpful, and then having a kind of core set of strategies that were my go-tos. So if I said to students, and I actually used the English names for these activities, I'd say special chair. Do you want to do special chair today, or do we want to make a story? Something like that. And I would sometimes let them choose. So they know within those, so I would say something like, 今天你们要做 special chair 还是一起编故事? So 编故事 is make a story, and I actually had that on a word wall, and I would point to that. So once I explained it once in English, then they got the sense of it, and I made sure they knew the name. So now I can just use that as I had a big, huge board. Let's see. This is a Spanish class. Does she do them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a little bit. She's got some rejoinders, which we'll get to shortly, so that's good to see. Yeah, I had stuff like, yeah, there's some question words. Those are super helpful. I had things like, kind of like I thought through what I wanted for total physical response stuff. I thought about what are the actions we do in class. So I had like look and listen, sing, dance, read, a lot of them, like about 20 different verbs, and I could point to that. Again, it had the Chinese in pinyin so that they could see the sounds of the word, and then the English right next to it. So, and I'd pause, and I could see them, you know, they're turning and looking at that one poster that has the meaning for them. There was a question over here. Yeah?
Was it an organic vocabulary list? So like as you're learning these things, they're going up there, you know, the target structures, or was it more of like printed poster that you had like, you know, pictures with?
Uh-huh. I did it as a poster in advance because I kind of figured out what I needed. Okay. But organically would be a great way to do it so that you don't have to prepare. You could just have a big poster space, and as you need it, then you find it. So you don't have to do all the planning in advance. You just use it as you come up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I put mine on big note cards, and then I keep them. So if I get that again next year,
That's super.
They just can't get. So like Grace gave it, they just not remember how to say, or what that do you think, or do you believe, they just never remember, so it's on there.
Right. Yeah, I also had one that I called useful words, and that kind of thing, like something that they might need when they can't say it yet, that they might want to try, though. So I would have things like, can I go to the bathroom, which is pretty traditional, I suppose, but slow down, can you say that again? How do you say this in Chinese? How do you say this in English? Those kinds of phrases, and that one, like, I think that, those kinds of starters would be super.
So like circumlocution type.
Yeah, exactly. And again, my posters were English for meaning and Chinese in. Word walls are super. The other thing, subtitling your instructions. So let's say you're giving a more involved new thing. You put it up on the board in English, but you're going to say it slowly, a piece at a time in your target language, and then point at the English and give them the time to go, okay, and then say it again in the target language. So it's going to take longer to give those instructions now, but in the long run, you don't have to have that subtitle anymore because they're going to recall it because they've heard it 3-4 times. So that was also something I did that was helpful. And then we mentioned it also, giving students resources to ask for clarification. So over on that useful words thing, can you say that again? I'm not sure what that meant. If there's a real breakdown, I would do this signal. This was timeout. I need to ask something in English, and I will use it, and also the students will sometimes use it. So, and I never taught them you should do this. They just started doing it. Like it was a level 1 class. I was so pleased because I was aiming for more target language, but in an unburdensome way. I've done the burdensome way. It was bad. I was really, like, we were marking down who spoke in English, and it just became really burdensome for me, and I didn't like the feel in the room, and the students told me, like, I'm scared to talk now because I'm afraid I'll say something English. And like, that's not what I wanted. So this was helpful, and I'll use it if I'm going to do a quick grammar aside. I'll stop here and then say this, 5 seconds, that's done. They'll use it to ask for clarification. So giving instructions. Building rapport. I already referred to this. Building that culture in class. How do you do that? Are there ways that you found to make your classroom culture feel welcoming, inviting, and target language rich?
The one I'm thinking of was a total accident. I found the Rebecca Black Friday song in Spanish, and I show it to my kids.
Yeah.
And there's a part that repeats where they go fiesta, fiesta, ole, and my kids will just randomly shout that during class.
Mm-hmm.
And it's obnoxious, but it's adorable, and they just have this little smile on their face like, oh yeah, how awesome.
Yeah.
That was kind of fun.
Yeah, super. So like little catchphrases that they hook onto and that they're interested in. Mm-hmm.
Or for both of you, so
awesome.
When they were in the set, that's what they would create.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's
I
from
don't know
my
what it
issue
means. So.
when I wrote out, like, my kids, where are my kids?
Oh my goodness! From that story,
Yeah,
like
they
it's a
ran-
horror story,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they were fond of it and they used it. Cool. Yeah. I think it's this thing that kind of develops over time. It's tricky. I was just in Jim Tripp's session on how he starts the school year, and he just made target language very accessible. He was calm, slowly using it, clarifying meaning by pointing to the English, really tracking with everybody in the room. Like that type of thing over time builds up, I think, and then providing these interesting things for them to engage with that are target language does that. And then that little signal helped me too. So we already talked about the useful phrases. Oh, I also had emotions. I usually started class. I had a poster over here. That's why I'm looking at that wall. I had a list of emotions or maybe states of being. So, and I would ask them, how are you today, at the beginning of many classes. And it could even, I had the words like optimistic, introverted, hardworking, those kinds of nice, rich, positive things that you can bring in culture too. In Chinese, to say someone's hardworking is really a common phrase. It's very highly valued. Li. So using that and giving them that opportunity, giving them the words that they that they want to talk about. Like if they walk in right before lunch and they're like, I am so hungry and I am exhausted. Or it's that you have them last period, they're going to talk about tired. And so giving them those words up there on that thing so you can use that. And then the rejoinders, you were talking about things that students just like blurt out. Those things over here are really super. If you find ones that are meaningful to you, that's great. It becomes a kind of a classroom culture thing too, I found. Once I had a poster up there, they would start to look after I had begun to introduce it. Grant Boulanger does a really great job with those, and he makes posters as well. But the way he filters those in very intentionally is really quite impressive. I was much more, whatever happens, let's see how it goes, And I'd have this list up on the wall, and I still continue to do that with students now, but he really did a thorough job of it if you're interested in making that happen. So we talked about clarifying meaning, using first language perhaps. Just something to think about, is it the same thing to point to the first language but say target language so that they understand it? Does it feel the same to you from your own perspective? Does it feel the same as if you spoke in the first language? No, because it doesn't to me. I'm seeing some head nods, and it's all right if you disagree. But I feel like that's a legitimate thing. When we have newly introduced vocabulary, or there's some key need to clarify the meaning, I think first language is super to use at that point. Other tools besides that need to be brought in, of course. So we mentioned gestures, tone of voice, your facial expressions, pictures, realia, all of those things. Martina Bex has a really wonderful blog post that I think lists about 21 different kinds of resources to make target language comprehensible. So if you're, I have a link embedded into this presentation, but she would be great to look up if you're looking for other ways to make sure target language is heavy, or shall we say rich, and understood. The other reason I think we might want to use a little bit of first language is comprehension checking. What did they understand out of the target language? Periodically, especially if you know there's something that is easily misunderstood in your new language, the language new to the students. Making sure that they don't lock in on incorrect understanding of it. I think that's a good use for first language too on occasion. We talked about grammar. Pop-ups. Are you familiar with the term pop-up? Has anybody heard a specific length for like a grammar pop-up? Like how long? 30 seconds?
I heard
10. I've heard 5. I've also heard, or actually I've seen, this means that. So you're pointing at the verb endings, for example, on languages that have those. I hear that there are some like that. I don't know. Chinese doesn't do it. Just a plug for Chinese, how wonderful it is. So you're pointing here, and like, what does the O mean in tango? Tango. right? Okay? And so the students say, it means I did it, or I have it. I have it? Okay, see, there we go. I'm learning so much Spanish now. So you did, here's the O, they said what it meant, you're done. It's less than 5 seconds even, but that's a grammar pop-up as well. You've noted a feature about the language and what it connects, this form of the language connects to that meaning, and so that's a grammar little mini pop-up. And so they can be extremely brief. If you find yourself going past 5 seconds, you might think about what purpose do you have behind that? Is it necessary now? Are they ready for that information about grammar? Is it because it's cool to you? Is it student-driven? I had some really analytical students, and they would ask those kinds of questions that I could not talk about in Chinese. And I would give them the short version, and we did this, 5-10 seconds. Rarely something a little longer. But if they were still like, no, but I don't get it. It's like, it's super that you want to know this. Can you talk to me at the end of class? That would be great. And I can even refer you to a website where you can read even more about it. It's totally a good question. I just need to continue to be in Chinese, and we've got this other thing we're going to. Because that was the one student that really had that question. So I didn't want to take all of class time for that particular thing. So, right. So the other thing is when. When does grammar instruction need to happen? Sometimes people present it first like it's a rule, and now we're going to encounter this rule, look for this rule, we're going to practice this rule. And generally speaking, in comprehension-based teaching, we want to flip that, so they're getting lots and lots of target language exposure that they understand. Perhaps, depending on your goals and maybe what requirements your school has for you, you want to point out at the end of class, by the way, this is this thing called this. You're going to have it at the end of your test that I'm required to give, or whatever. You don't have to be snarky, but I got a little snarky in that. I have to give, but and it's fascinating to some people. So it's not like it's bad to have grammar instruction or notice things about language. I think it's fine, but just how much and when, and how much do you need the first language to do it? Any other thoughts? Okay. I would say talk openly with the students about what your expectations are, and even maybe have it on the wall so that you've got an expectation. Like the one I had on the wall was support the flow of, in my case, Chinese. So it wasn't saying you could never use English. It was saying our goal is a flow of Chinese in the classroom. If we have a breakdown because, we've lost comprehension, that's a legit reason to call. Here is my signal for I don't understand, and then this one for I really have to ask something in English. So that phrasing, support the flow of target language, was from Elisa Shapiro-Rosenberg. She's a teacher in north of Chicago. And I loved it because it was so positive, and it didn't set a percentage rule, and it didn't say don't use English. I liked it that it was like, here's what you should do instead of what you should not do. I've heard of people, and I've tried it myself, doing some language policing, where there's even a student job. I've heard some people where they really feel successful with that set a positive vibe. In my case, I tried it, and it wasn't a positive vibe, and it became this kind of friction point for students. So there's some cautions. I've also seen somebody do, she had a stuffed animal, and it was like the caterpillar of shame or something like that. And if you spoke in English without permission, that sat on your desk. And the testimony was, it was fun, it was light, it was reminding the kids like, oh, I did it again, oh man. And it wasn't this negative thing, so it's a possibility. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's stuff on blogs and online if you do a little search for either English police or language police, something like that. It might. There's an article, too, that was about kind of that, where it was a classroom in Sweden where they were learning English, and they were policing each other, and like how they got themselves to avoid using their first language. Some final thoughts, and then we'll take some questions and do some practice with stuff, I think. What if your own target language proficiency is what holds you back from using more target language in class? What do you think? let's do a share. If the target language proficiency is the issue that you're concerned about, like what drives you towards English is that you're not feeling as confident in your own target language. What can we do about that? Talk for a couple of minutes and we'll come back together. Practice.
So for your presentation, I had to make it viewed.
What I would do.
So when you're done presenting, if you don't want them to have it, you'll have to go in and remove that share.
Thanks. It's fine for me to share it. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Remind me
They
your
have a
name.
lot of trouble when they go through their food
Okay.
experiences because
We
they
met
know that
before,
they
right?
don't
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I saw you in Dunkerton for the Beast Cafes Lopez, and I've seen you somewhere.
Yeah, you were very familiar. So Rebecca, got it. Yeah, great. I would love to hear your ideas. You had a lot of enthusiasm behind that.
Practice.
Practice and be specific. What do you mean? Like, how can you do that?
So like, well, we go into the classroom knowing what we want to cover for the day. So the night before, practice it. Figure out what you need to say. If there's something that you aren't comfortable with, look it up, figure it out that way. Almost like have
Script
a script
yourself.
for yourself. Yeah.
Absolutely, totally legit.
I'm going to say model the journey because I told my kids that your language learning journey never ends, and so they need to know what it looks like. You know, we talked about, well, I don't use that word. I've never had to use that word. Here, go word reference it for me.
Exactly. Yeah. And letting students do the task of looking it up. Yeah, that's super. I totally agree. And I'm a second language speaker of Chinese, obviously, and likewise, I would let them know, like, that I have a lot to offer. I don't know the word moose, but I can look that up for you. You know, I didn't need that when I lived in China, and so, you know, they have these funny questions when they're 10 years old compared to what I needed when I was living in Kunming. So, yeah, and that's fine. And yeah, letting them know, do you know every word in English yet? No, of course not. It's fine. It's not I think sometimes we feel more scared of that, but if we set the tone that, yes, I'm the expert at acquiring another language and helping you to do it, not at being perfect, which, yeah, you had something back there too.
Yeah, kind of going off the same thing, like if I expect my students to be comfortable making mistakes, then I can't hold myself back from showing them what that courage looks like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I know. I've joked about it so many times. Oh, there I go doing Spanglish again.
Yeah. So doing some scripting, preparing for exactly what you're going to do, modeling how to get what you need in the moment when you have a word missing or something like that. Other thoughts?
I think even challenging yourself, like to have a conversation partner that's a native speaker or to go abroad during the summer or something, finding those opportunities that you can grow yourself. And it might not be something that would happen overnight. Obviously, it's going to take time. But you can build your skill and grow and read in the target language more and find things that you enjoy that are going to help you build that skill.
Right. And along those lines, like that, finding those ways that you can improve your own Chinese, Well, see, that's obviously what I was thinking about. But I used to think, and it's funny, even to some degree after I started trying to teach based on comprehension, I would find myself burdening myself with this idea that I needed to learn more vocabulary, to master more vocabulary, and I needed to read really, really hard things. And like, that's not how the theory behind this works. It's much more like I+1, right? You can understand the whole message, but you couldn't produce that whole message yet. So you're getting the input that you need, and your brain is sorting it out, and you can't always see exactly where it's coming from, but because you're continuing to take in input, you're going to get it. So started watching videos online to some degree, reading books that were easy for me, stopped feeling guilty about reading books that were easy for me in Chinese. Like I didn't have 25 new words on the page. I had one, but it really helped me notice, like, I'm not using "la" properly, because look, it came up. I had the mental resource to notice the things that I was still working on in my own language. So reading books that are made for learners was legit. Reading a translation of a children's book was the first novel I read. I read The Hobbit in Chinese. That was my first book. So, yeah, keep getting that. If you like certain kinds of movies, find them in Spanish if you teach Spanish. All of those. Yeah. There was one other thought about, before I go to my last question, one other thought that I forgot to put on my list that I think works nicely if what you find is students are going into off-task chatter or super excited about, we're making this one-word image, and they have this really highfalutin great idea, and it's stifling them, or it's classroom management kind of an issue. This was from Mike Peto, P-E-T-O, called Harnessing a Running Horse. And I'll admit, I haven't done it, but I saw it on video, and it was brilliant. So it's in the back of my mind, because actually, I kind of did it once last summer when I had a class that was face-to-face. They were excited about something that we were creating, and they spontaneously are like starting to talk amongst themselves about this and that thing. Wow, that's a good problem. They're so excited about this thing that's happening in class. So he called it like harnessing a running horse. So made it look like it was his intention to give them 20 seconds or 30 seconds to chat with their seatmate in English about that thing. And he's like, okay, and go, or something. He has a little video online. So if you look up his name and harnessing a running horse, I think you're going to find something that's like that. So then you're using their target or their first language, but you're just kind of letting them burn that out, and then maybe you can pull them back in and super idea is way too complex. Let's go for this or this. What do you think? And back into target language to present that kind of option to them. So they got the excitement and enthusiasm out, and then you could bring it back to target language that was at their level of comprehension. Target language use. How will you communicate with administrators, parents, and students about what your expectations are with target language use in your classroom? And we have time. Turn and talk, if you would, for about a minute. How do you communicate with them about what you do in class, or how might you do that?
Email. Yeah, you guys are good at coming back to attention. Thank you. I haven't been teaching in a classroom in 2 years, and so I forget those tricks. I'm feeling good. It worked. So what do you think about communicating with, and they could be different, administrators, parents, students? I'm also interested if you've had people push back about target language use and how you dealt with that.
I use a thing called Remind to give my students messages, and I had a parent contacted the counselor first instead of talking to me. He said, why are you writing all in Spanish?
Yeah.
And because that's what I do.
Yeah.
And I want them to practice outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to write messages in both Spanish and English.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were concerned about the out of class, like the internet-based stuff. Did they have questions about how you taught too, or? Yeah.
It was no, I think it was more he didn't speak Spanish, and he didn't like maybe the fact that his kid could understand something that he couldn't possibly.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So if you have parents that don't know the language you're teaching, I've experienced this a bit with Chinese. They're concerned about their student, like they don't know what's going on. So it can be that kind of parental concern, being, but also then that sense of maybe embarrassment that they can't cope with some of what their child's learning. They didn't have that. Yeah, good that he got over that. I have heard that before, though, where people were like saying, like, you're speaking too much Spanish in your Spanish class. Wait, let's think about that. So, understanding that you have to explain, like, we're not learning just about the language or about the structure of the language. We are learning to communicate, and so we need to use the language in the classroom. That's how we acquire language. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Newsletters this year, parents, and one of them is actually my principal's daughter, so that was fun, because I got to hit admin and parents at the same time.
Yeah.
And so the first one I sent out was just introducing myself, that my classroom is going to be really different, and we're going to talk in Spanish all the time, and I got the idea from you parents. You parents are the best language teachers that have ever lived. You taught your kids how to speak in English. You did it by doing this and this and this and this, and guess what? We're going to do those exact same things, and then we're going to talk about why the language looks like this. And they were really excited about it. And then it also, the newsletters gave them something to talk with their students about when they came home, because, at conferences, it's always like, oh, my kid doesn't talk to me about school. It's like, well, now you have a conversation topic.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
I found just being transparent with the parents, with the students. We have seesaw portfolios, the students' work can be seen on those portfolios, but also just on social media, showing things I'm doing in the classroom, also just making those expectations really clear at the beginning of the year in the syllabus, putting it online in Google Classroom, always having an open door policy. If they have a question, they can talk to me about it.
Great.
And then also educating your administrators about what you're doing. They don't maybe know what CI is or what TPRS is, but if you educate them and help them to understand some of the research behind it and why it's a good thing, they'll be more likely to be on board with what you're doing.
Right. Yeah. I find it's sometimes I've had an administrator who is very supportive of me as a teacher, but she was then expected to observe me and then evaluate my teaching, and she was intimidated by that. So I had a checklist that I gave them, and one of the things on the checklist was use of target language, and why it would be high, and do the students show comprehension? That's the issue, not does the observer, but they need to know that there's a rich language environment going on. Yeah. Do you ever have students who protest or refuse to go with the plan? Yes.
Yeah, but always, no matter what it is, there's always someone that doesn't want to do it.
True. Anything that you do, they're going to have, It's kind of like you want to give them a safe place to push back, because they're going to push back sometime because they're teenagers or